All right, team, we are back in the Fireside PM podcast, and I have Yui Zhao with me, who has a really cool story. Very successful career as a product leader, both at big tech and some large venture-backed startups, and now is a coach working with heads of product and product leaders. And I asked that we spend a little time at some point talking about any kind of unique challenges or advice for women product leaders, but we're going to cover kind of general as well. Before we get into it, Yui, why don't you just give us a little introduction?
Sure. Happy to be here. Thank you, Tom. So as I mentioned, I've been in product for the last almost 2 decades. I started my career as the first PM at Thumbtack, which is a local services marketplace. I joined when they had 12 people, post Series A, and stayed with them for 5 years, eventually leading product on the supply side of the marketplace. So building out experiences for small businesses like plumbers and DJs and house cleaners to find customers through the platform. I went from that experience, which I got very lucky in joining a Sequoia-backed growth stage company. I went from there to Instagram in the San Francisco office when they had first opened that new building. The elevators weren't even quite working on our first day. But I joined the consumer team and I led the team on feed creation as well as profile. So that Instagram profile we all love, and we did a redesign while I was there, and had some fun moments in it. I went from there to COVID. When COVID hit, I joined one of the teams that were spun out to actually build a competitor for Zoom. Facebook and Meta did not have a strong desktop presence, and they wanted to sort of build up their desktop sort of presence. And so I joined a team that was leading that, and then spent a bit of time towards the end of my 5 years there working with Yardley Poll on small business advertising, going back to sort of my roots at Thumbtack. From there, I wanted to go back into the startup world. So I joined Fuzzy, which was a telehealth platform for pets. So you can get prescriptions for your preventatives and allergies and diarrhea through telehealth for your beloved dog or cat. And I was their chief product officer, and about 6 months in, took on the role of chief technology officer as well. After that stint, I decided to take a break from product, and about a year ago transitioned into coaching full time. I've been coaching since 2016, mostly product leaders at that point. But more recently transitioned to focus on women and minority leaders in that director, senior manager phase who really want to get to the VP and the C-suite. I think it's one of the transitions that is very difficult to make, and really it requires a change in perspective on what's important, what are the skill sets you need to build, but also perspective on the overall business rather than a particular product area or functional area. It's a bit about me. I have a 9-year-old corgi, and I tried to make him Instagram famous while I was at Instagram. And he's our first kid.
Love it. Yeah, my youngest keeps asking me to get him a corgi. I find them adorable as well. That might be in the cards down the road, but we already have a lab, so I feel like one dog is sufficient. Tell me a little bit about that transition from kind of a product leader at a large organization like Instagram, and then the ad stuff, to CPO. I have had this conversation with a lot of people around that CPO job is one of the hardest jobs out there. And I'm curious, do you agree with that, or what's your take on it?
I think it depends on what's hard for you.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, when I was at Meta and Instagram, I was leading larger and larger teams. And it got
Mm-hmm.
to a point where I felt like to grow my career and myself and be more successful and move up the ranks at Meta, it was much more about large organizational politics and getting buy-in than it was about truly product strategy. And I struggled with that. And there was a large part of me that wanted to get back to business strategy and product strategy and what is the thing that's going to grow the company versus, learning how to navigate a larger and larger organization and supporting a larger and larger team. And so when I made that transition to CPO, I absolutely loved it. Was it difficult? Yes. One of the first things I did actually and had to do was revisit who was on the entire PM and design team, revisit how we built products. They were not doing sort of a pod-based structure, and instead it was very waterfall and very, there's a lot of silos in between the functions. And so there was a lot of that work that, I would never be asked to do at Meta. The way we run product is probably going to be the way we run product for quite a while. And you can make small tweaks and changes, but it wasn't going to be drastically different. But I really enjoy those types of challenges. And in addition, the company was looking to reinvent its product strategy and add a completely new tier or way of working. And those are the challenges that I enjoy. But I can also see that for a different type of person, they might come into the role and say, wow, that's a lot more risky than I had thought. Or, wow, there's a lot that I have to, build a plane and fly it at the same time. I have to change the org and the strategy and interface with the board and build a new team. That's just too much. So I think it really comes down to where do you and how do you want to grow and what types of challenges do you want to wake up every morning trying to solve?
I was talking to a CPO last week who was asking for some advice on stuff, and he was struggling to find a way to work with the CEO that was working for both of them and for the company. And first thing I said was like, this is not an unusual challenge.
No, it is not. It's a quite common challenge.
Yeah. Maybe could you share with people who, let's say there's some PM director out there who's like, fast moving, high achieving, and she gets offered a CPO job at a company. What advice would you have for her about building that win-win partnership with her CEO?
It starts at the interview. It starts with understanding the CEO or the founder. So the reason I laughed is that I believe that the head of product, VP, CPO, whatever role, and the founder who was the product visionary, that relationship is one of the most difficult ones to get right. And the reason is that was that founder's role. It was the founder's baby. And they had enough success to get to a point where now they can hire a relatively expensive role and position into the company. So that's the context somebody is coming into, right? Especially if you're the first official, head of product person. And if there were, by the way, if there were previous heads of product, VPs of product, you got to ask why those people left. You have to find out, what worked, what didn't work, and what you are expected to do differently. But let's assume for now that, this is you coming into a company, then in a sense, you're taking over what this person was doing, and the expectations are going to be extremely high of this is what I want from that person. And starting from the first conversation you have with the CEO or the founder, you have to get a clear understanding of, does this person know what they want? Like, are they just asking for everything? Or are they actually know, like, oh, I want somebody who is strategy oriented, or I want somebody to really focus on execution and org building? And then two, does what they want match what you want? I wouldn't be sort of talking yourself into, oh, they want me to do execution, but maybe over time they're going to want me to do vision and strategy. Guess what? The founders at Instagram still cared about the gradient on stories, like when Instagram was more than 1 billion users. So some things may never change. And so just knowing what you're walking into without some assumption of like, well, the CPO role should own strategy, right? Great. But is
Mm-hmm.
that really what the CEO and the founder is looking for? And then actually trying to work together on a strategy or a project or a decision while you're in that interview process can be very powerful. And the reason I say that is that's when you really suss out like, how does this person think? How do I think? Do they take feedback and criticism well, or are they really opinionated and persistent? Do I feel like I'm valued? Do I feel like my opinions are valued? Or is it that they already have their opinion and I'm just brought in to execute? Sussing those things out before you walk in on day one and sort of commit to the role is going to help you really understand like how do I build that relationship and how do I scope my role going forward.
If we flipped it and you had to give advice to a CEO, a founder CEO who is hiring their first CPO, what would you tell them?
I would ask them why, in the sense that you have, owned product strategy up to this point. There's something that is saying to you, hey, you can no longer do this role. And I would ask them very specifically, what is it? Is it because you're trying to be the salesperson and the PR person and the person facing with VCs and you're the only person that can do that? And so therefore you have to give up the product piece because you're just not in the day-to-day anymore? Or is it because you want someone to come in and scale the org and you just haven't seen how to build out a 10-person PM team and you want somebody who's been there and done that to do it? Whatever it is, and it could be a combination of those things, but whatever it is, being really clear on this is the part of the job that I was doing that I now want help with is going to help you figure out what you want that product leader to look like. Because otherwise, you're both going to want to be the decision maker, right? Of the direction of the product, the direction of the business as a consequence. And then that's going to create a scenario where the teams cannot run autonomously and you're still going to be in the day-to-day, but in fact more frustrated because you have this added person you now have to bring along. And so you want to make sure that whatever it is you're looking for in this role, that it's additive to what you think you can accomplish on a day-to-day basis.
That makes perfect sense. We could do a whole episode on the CPO role. But I do want to talk about, the area that you're focused on now, which is coaching up directors and senior managers of product to kind of get to that next level. What is your sense of the current challenges that they're facing now versus like a few years ago? Has the kind of change in the economy and staffing affected the kind of challenges people are facing, or is it pretty much similar all across the board?
I would say that with the rise of remote work, there's been an interesting split in terms of challenges facing women, particularly in the hybrid environment, right? You may have heard the sort of stereotypical finding that like women prefer more flexible work, right? We prefer more hybrid or remote types of roles where you can more easily juggle things around the home with things at work. And some of my clients and folks would joke that the people who are calling for the return to office are all white men, because they want to like be in the office, talking to people, hang out with their buddies. You hear very few women leaders being like, hey, I want to go back to, obviously there are, but stereotypically you hear more women being like, hey, I'd like to be at home because it allows me to pick up my kid more easily, or, do some chores around the house or go to an appointment and I can have flexibility in that work. So I think that with that sort of delineation, if you will, or change that's risen, I've seen more clients who are in places where they're in that hybrid remote role while, a percentage of other leaders are in office. And that creates a very difficult dynamic where, there's rarely any good alternative to water cooler talk and just running into people in the hallways. And so if half of your leaders are doing that and the other half are not, guess who's getting the next promotion, right? And so that's, I think, one challenge that's been new in the last few years. But on top of that, I think the gap from director to executive for women has always been challenging because it coincides with family and child rearing years for many people.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't always, right? It's not true for everybody, but for a lot of folks, the years in their 30s to their 40s, while they're getting to that director phase, getting to VP, are also the years where they have kids at home, young kids at home who need a lot of their attention. And so, yes, you can outsource. Yes, you can find help if you're in the position to do that. But that double challenge is why I think you see a large percentage of women drop out of either the workforce entirely or actually just slow down their careers as a result, because it's difficult to keep up the type of work and hours and sort of mental pressure required at the VP and C-suite level, C-suite, especially in product.
Yeah, and those 2 points kind of converge a little bit. Like if they are if let's say many women will appreciate the flexibility of hybrid work and therefore have to give up that water cooler FaceTime, and their kids still need like a lot of support, there's only 24 hours in a day. What are you, I mean, I've seen some cases where uh, a person makes a decision like they actually will not have kids or completely outsource a lot of the family stuff. It just seems like a very difficult trade-off to make, because in the long run, level X versus X plus one like may not be as big of a deal as like,
Yeah.
but how do you help people think through those trade-offs? Because it's hard to have it all, right?
It's hard to have it all at the same time.
Yeah.
And I think timing is the key here. So it is difficult and a bit unfair. If you think about the 9 to 5 job, it was designed for a family where one person went to work 9 to 5 and the other person was full-time stay at home. That's what these jobs are designed for. And again, CPO roles are not 9 to 5, unfortunately, but it requires a bit more. And so if you have 2 people in the family who are both 9 to 5, then you essentially need a third person, right? A third stay-at-home mom equivalent. And you can piece that together with help and grandparents and schools and au pairs. But to your point, you do kind of have to give up the things that come with spending more time with your kids in those ages, and you become the breadwinner, and then however you piece together the help for your kids becomes the stay-at-home mom, quote unquote. And so that can be a very challenging decision, and it's a very personal one. So the way that I work with my clients through this is really focusing on like, okay, tell me where you are in your career and what your ambition is, and how much does timing matter? How much does momentum and speed matter? How much does the financials matter, right? And then on the personal side, like, what are you afraid of, right? Like, what do you want to make sure you're there for your kids? What are you willing to quote unquote give up for your career growth? And what are you not willing to give up? And how can we make those things work? And then I think there's a third piece, which is the environment and the context that you're in. There are certain companies, Meta and Google included, that are going to be a bit more friendly towards people who are juggling career and family. And then there's a lot of companies out there which are not, and just doesn't understand it at all. They're the only female director on the engineering team, and everyone else is men, including the VP and the CTO, right? Like, and so can you shift that environment? Can you change that environment? And so it's really pulling on all 3 pieces at the same time to find a place where they feel like they have a good balance at the moment, but also understanding that as the kids get older, I don't have old kids yet, but many of my clients do, as they get older, they also then get to a place when the kids go off to college where there's another chapter in their career, right? And Arianna Huffington, Nancy Pelosi, there are now examples of women who have, after their children have gone to college, said, I'm going to re-kickstart my career and get to whatever that level is that I've always wanted to get to. And I think people don't, before they talk to coaches, they don't tend to think that long term about like, okay, I need to think like 15 years down the line. and how I set myself up for that. And that ends up being a conversation that's very interesting from them from an intellectual perspective to be like, okay, I can't have it all now, but it is actually possible to go back and have it in, 10 years.
Yeah. What advice would you have for someone who's in that situation where they maybe shifted into a lower gear when the kids were still at home, and now they just dropped off their youngest from college, and they're like, "Oh, I now can go all in," you know? What's that like to shift back up? Because presumably for the last few years, they weren't on the fast track, and now they've got to reinvent themselves. Like, what is that like?
Yeah. Get into Gen AI. It's a big skill to learn if you haven't learned it already. But I think skills aside, it's reestablishing your network and your relationships. So reaching out to people, having coffee, having conversations, and being like, "Hey, I'm interested in like sort of reaccelerating my career." I think people sometimes underestimate the power of those conversations and just letting others know, whether it's their current manager, their current leadership, their current team, or people beyond that, right? Like connections that they may have lost touch with over time, to be like, hey, I'm ready to reignite my career and I'm excited to get back into it full time, right? And then the other thing that I often ask them is, do you feel like you can reinvent yourself where you are? So like if they've had a job for a while, right, at the company, and it's been like 10 years, they have a reputation of a sort, they have a brand, they're known for something. Yes, you can reinvent yourself at work, but it's often difficult. So at least think about like a team switch or a project switch, something to change up your day-to-day environment, because guess what? The engineering partner who worked with you for the last 10 years is going to have a hard time with a new version of you, as quickly as a week. And actually, they won't help you in that acceleration because they're going to keep kind of dragging you back to the version of you that they know, versus if you were in a new project with a new partner and a new set of cross-functional teammates, they don't really know the old you. So you can kind of come in strong, and then they're going to play to that, and they'll actually help you accelerate your process of getting back up to full speed.
Yeah, I totally agree with that consideration of a team change. It's kind of similar to sometimes there were people who worked at in the org, and then they went off to business school, and then they came back, and I always felt like, well, that's Bob, he's the APM.
Yeah, exactly. It's hard to outgrow that first impression of you, right?
Right. Yeah.
There was an intern who I worked with at Thumbtack, and he was still in college when he was an intern on my team. And 5 years later, I still sometimes think of him as an intern. Where I'm like, no, he's now a tech lead.
Yeah.
Like, I need to think of this person differently. But it can, that's why sort of changing that environment when you want to sort of change a version of yourself can apply to more than just returning to work. It can apply to other aspects as well.
Totally. Setting aside the whole work-life balance and family kind of planning stuff, let's talk a little bit about what it's like being a woman product leader in what is still a largely male dominated industry. I don't think it's as bad as it was maybe 10 years ago, but it's still like uneven. I had the privilege of working under Susan Wojcicki for a few years at YouTube. Incredibly impressive and inspiring leader. But that we didn't have a lot of women VPs at that time, and I'm curious, what did you see personally as a woman PM leader? And do you feel like there were unique challenges aside from what we've already discussed to being successful in that role as a woman? Or is it ultimately, hey, it's about hitting your OKRs and, getting good peer reviews?
I wish it was just that. So funnily enough, one of the reasons one of the things that I did explicitly in my career was look for a female product leader to work with. Because I had spent, at that point, this was at Meta. So I had gone through Thumbtack. I had worked at Instagram. I had worked on this COVID SWAT team in Messenger. And I was looking for my next sort of team. And the only thing I had in my head was I have yet to report to a female product leader. And, skip levels and whatnot, there had been other female product leaders, but I had never had a manager that was a woman. And I was like, I am going to find a woman to work for because I want that experience. Because I knew that was going to be my last role at Meta, and I was going to go back to a startup, and that was going to be even harder. We could talk about founders and, gender dynamics there, but I knew that was going to be harder than doing it at Meta, which actually has a relatively speaking high percentage of female product leaders. So that's how I found Yardley. And I was like, I don't care what she's working in. I'm just going to work on her team because I want that experience. So it is so difficult. Technology, I think, has one of the higher percentages of female product leaders. Healthcare is the other one that tends to have more females in leadership, not necessarily in product. And so I think I've been lucky to have worked in places where, at least from a culture perspective, there was a desire to not have a gender imbalance. And that was actually spoken about and, thought was given to, and we try to make things fair, right? There are many places where that's not true, where there's bias and there's a lot of that goes unchallenged. I think some of the things, to your second question around, in addition to OKRs and peer reviews, what are the things that matter? I think a lot of it comes down to this warmth and competence dilemma that we've heard a lot about, right? So very early on in my career, one of the feedback I got was people thought that I was intimidating. And I literally didn't know how to respond to that feedback because I was like, I don't feel like I'm an intimidating person, right? It turned out that the people who gave that feedback felt that it was strange for a woman to be so direct and so passionate and so persistent in pushing an idea forward. They expected a bit more like accommodation or understanding or, kindness, as they put it, in terms of how I was responding to their comments and how I was taking their feedback and perspective into consideration. And then another dynamic that comes, I think, for women leaders especially, is that you tend to underestimate how much power you have walking into a room. So when I was a CPO, right, and I would walk into a room and have a conversation or discussion with the rest of the group, I tend to underestimate how quote unquote intimidating that can be, given the role that I'm in. And I over-index on, if you know me personally, I'm a very warm and friendly and happy person, and very easy to talk to. And so I think it's being aware of that balance and that your perception of yourself does not equal another person's perception of yourself. And that matters so much in the work environment and the leadership environment that I think, for better or worse, men just don't have to deal with as much. I think their direct perception of how do I come off is often more accurate representation of how they are perceived in the workplace.
Yeah, that's so interesting in that it sounds like what you're saying is, in your experience, your directness was observed in a different way than if I were in that same role and just as direct.
Correct.
And so I'm kind of, I'm torn on this one because part of me is like, well, why should you change? Like, that it's not your problem that they have these issues. On the other hand, it's like, well, they are part of the organization. Like, how do you, what advice do you give women who get that feedback when they're not really being overly direct? It's just that the recipient of the information is interpreting it through a lens.
Correct. And there's a lot of biases like these, right? There's a negativity bias where with people unlike you, when they make a mistake, you tend to interpret it as something that is a trend rather than a one-time thing. So if I missed a product launch, you're
Mm.
more likely to think like, oh, Yui always misses product launches, rather than like, oh, there was a reason, you know, blah, 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 and she's missed a specific one, but it won't happen again. There's also, you know, the affinity bias, which we all know, where it's like you tend to more positively interpret any results from people like you and think that they're more likely to succeed versus someone unlike you, where you much more judge on what have they accomplished and rather than like, do they have the potential to do this? And yeah, it's not fair, but the world's not fair. And, you know, the way that my sort of perspective on this is that you play the game and then you try to change the game. And there's no point in trying to go to every person that encounters you and be like, hey, you have this bias. Why can't you treat me the same way you would treat Tom or some other white guy and pretend that I'm that person? There are times where I have gone and asked the, you know, in my history, I asked the person, would you have given me this feedback if I were a white man? And every single time, it is an extremely thought-provoking question for them. But those are like smaller instances. More often than not, you just don't have the energy and the mental capacity or the time to sort of try to change all of these biases and get your job done and hit your OKRs, right? And so my perspective on this has been change what you can so that it's not detrimental to your growth. Like it's not a barrier or a hurdle that's stopping you from moving forward, because when it is, you've got to fix it. But when it's not, move forward and then get to a point where you can fix it and like looking back, right? Because some of these things are more easily done with power. If you're a Sheryl Sandberg trying to get a parking spot for pregnant women, guess what? That's a lot easier than if you were a, you know, entry-level engineer or PM trying to get a parking spot for pregnant women. There's just a, you know, asymmetry in power dynamics. And one of the best ways to get ahead of that is to get yourself ahead so that you can go back and help others.
So how did you deal with that situation? Because I could argue that being direct and clear in communications is a very good thing. And so if you're getting all this feedback, like, whoa, you're so direct, like part of me would be like, well, maybe you soften it up a little bit, but then the meetings are less decisive and there's more ambiguity, which is not good, a good thing. So how did you navigate that?
So one of the things I realized was that when you get to know someone more, they become less intimidating and you can be more direct with that person. And so something that I had spent a lot of, like, if you and I meeting for the first time, if this is the first meeting we were ever in and it's a group meeting and I'm super direct, you're going to interpret it that way. Versus if you and I had gone for 5 coffee chats and we had hung out and, you know, we've worked on something else in the past, you're going to be like, oh, that's just the way that Yui is. And she's doing this for the better of the goal and moving things forward and et cetera. And so I never was less direct, because to your point, it doesn't help to be less direct, especially large organizations. But instead, I spent more time building up relationships and credibility one-on-one so that they got to know me, they got to know how I think, they got to know who I was. And that often softened sort of the conversation when it came to group conversations. I also picked and chose my battles. You know, the other thing that I did was I sometimes would do more smaller group conversations rather than one large group conversation. And so I would change up like the formats of how I was communicating from either, you know, a meeting to async, or from like a large group to smaller groups to one-on-ones, so that I'm more effective in driving things forward without coming off as too intimidating.
Wow. This is fascinating. I mean, it sounds like you probably had to put in some extra one-on-ones and coffee chats to get the same results that someone else would just kind of just go into it without having to do that. That is unfair, but it sounds like, you know, that's the reality of the way the world is right now. we could go on for a long time, but I know we're running a little over. So I want to make sure I asked you about like what is your coaching practice like? Like what kinds of folks do you work with and how do you engage with them?
Yeah, so I primarily work with senior managers and directors who actually span the spectrum in terms of their function. The thing that I mostly focus on is women and minorities who's in that senior manager director phase and has aspirations to move up. I love working with ambitious, aspiring leaders who want to go from that middle management into the executive leadership levels. And the way that we work is I do one-on-one coaching, which is once a month for an hour. And I have sort of minimum commitments in terms of amount of time to really see that acceleration. And then I also do group coaching, which are 8-week cohorts where I try to get actually a diversity of different functions together, but at the same level. And we work through challenges that these people are facing. So it's been fantastic. I've really, really enjoyed the transition that I took from, product into coaching. And there's interestingly many similarities between the two, as I'm sure you have found as well.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. What advice do you have for people who are trying to decide between working with you one-on-one versus joining a cohort? I could see they having different advantages and disadvantages.
Sure. Well, one-on-ones are more expensive, so I'll start with that. But it is much more tailored to your specific scenario and your specific situation. And so, I think there's a range. There's classes you can take, right, which are relatively generic on, let's say, executive presence or influence or whatnot, but it's not tailored at all really to your situation. Then there's group classes. And group cohorts for me, I keep them really small. There's only 5 people per cohort, and there's 8 weeks. And so every week we focus on a particular person. So we get somewhat into a particular person's issue, but it's only one time, maybe 1.5 times. And then we also have some more generic skill set conversations. So it's not as in-depth as what you're going to get one-on-one, which is me working with you over 6 months, a year, to really get you to that next step. And so different people need different things. And some people look for more community, which the group is much better for as well. And many of my groups continue after the 8 weeks, versus they're like, I have a unique situation. I want the fast pass and someone to support me to get to that next level. And that type of attention and detail you're only going to get in a one-on-one session.
They both sound great. Where can people find more information about your coaching stuff?
Yeah, so I have a website. It's www.yuizhao.coach. You can also find me on LinkedIn /yuizhao. And I have a Substack. It's called The Uncommon Executive. It's yuizhao.substack.com. And I share insights on career growth and learnings from my clients, as well as my personal sort of journey through the product world.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for coming on the pod, Yui. It's been a great discussion, and I know people will really benefit from it, and hopefully they'll reach out to you for more help as well.
Amazing. Thank you, Tom, for having me.
You bet. Take care, Yui.
Take care. Bye.
All right. That was a great conversation. Go check out Yui Zhao. I put a link in the description below to her LinkedIn, but you can always also check her out, yuizhao.coach, I think. So some takeaways from my perspective. Number one is it's a good reminder how if you're working with anyone who doesn't come from a, kind of traditional background, just know that everybody's going up against different challenges that may not be obvious to you. And so, the whole hey, you're too direct feedback that she was referencing, that would suck. I would feel very frustrated if I got that feedback, because I would be like, well, I'm trying to help the organization make hard decisions. I'm trying to be as efficient as I can. At the same time, if other people are perceiving it in a way because of maybe not because of anything I did, but because of how they perceive, different people's roles when they're growing up. That's something definitely to be mindful about, both if you are in that position, but especially if you're not in that position, and just, maybe kind of be a little bit more aware that, okay, am I calling out these things about this individual? Would I call those things out if they were more like me? If they had a similar background to me or had similar, profile. And if the answer is no, then you probably should give that person a little bit more grace. Or maybe you should give that person as much grace as you would give yourself. If they were like your twin in that situation. So it's a good reality check. I'm glad that Yui brought that up and we had her on the Fireside PM pod. I will have a write up on this interview like I do with all of them on my Substack, which is firesidepm.substack.com. And you can also check out Yui's as well. She's also, I think it's yuizhao.substack.com. So check that all out. And if you found this conversation useful, give it a thumbs up, share it, and then comment below. Are there other things that you think we can all learn from each other on in terms of how to work better together and help everybody kind of reach their full potential? And then last thing is, if you have any guests that you think would be interesting on the pod, either someone that you really like and think would be a great guest, or if you have a particular perspective you want to share that would be useful to product managers and would make for a cool conversation, just hit me up. All right, with that, I'm going to wrap things up on this stream and let's get back to work.